Okay, Robert Files from Lancaster University, Lancaster Center of Marketing, Analytics and Forecasting. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you, Anna and Sherry, for organizing these various sessions. I want to spend just a moment for you to read, hopefully you can, the epigram, I think, in the middle of the first slide. It seems odd, really, to spend any time on it, although I enjoyed it when I first read it, and which was a long time ago, and it stuck. So, glorious columns of ascertained facts and legalized measures that beauty is to be found. Well, that's sort of what I, hopefully with Paul and Anna and Shari later, have been trying to put together. What do we know about forecasting value, and in the end, what should we know? So that's the agenda, to try and sort of put things together. First, obviously, we've got to define it, and then a little about why it's important. What I've tried to do is look at a variety of databases and answer the question, does adjustment add value, and under what circumstances? And then talk a little about inefficiency and capitalizing on forecast value added. That is really work to be done. So what is forecast value added? Well, basically, most companies, as far as we can ascertain, at least those are make to order, retail, and probably service as well, take their baseline statistical forecast and adjust it. And there's evidence across a wide variety of studies that actually we're talking often of figures of about 80%. One of the major sources for this data from Philip Hans Francis was about 90%. So what you're going to do is take a statistical model, note the I limited aspirations in my slide preparation, but here we've got the magician. Now, note what the magician is adding to. A simple exponential smoothing model, but also potentially something more complicated with an XT, some explanatory variables. And of course, as we move into a world of machine learning, potentially that's increasingly important, and possibly the magician becomes less important. Who knows? We don't. So why is it important? I've already said we've figures of 70–90%, although in other domains, these figures may be less. It's common in other domains. We've tended to spend time, really by accident, Paul and I, working with Kostas Nikolopoulos and Michael Lawrence, tripped over this issue, or rediscovered it, to be fair, because it had been examined in the 80s and early 90s by Matthews and name gone, anyway, Diamantopoulos. But other domains, weather forecasting, macroeconomic forecasting, also have this. One suspects that where forecasts are concerned, traffic forecasting and so on, you will find adjustments. It's time consuming. It can be complex. The evidence on its effectiveness, however, is really very mixed. And it's a bit hard to sort out. There's some references there. We don't really know what makes adjustments effective. We have a number of speculative hypotheses because the various studies have not been carried out under anything like the same framework. We really don't conclude very much, other than there's a misinterpretation one way or another of historical data. And that comes also, I hasten to add, although linking this work with experimental evidence is work also to be done. How do we measure forecast value added? Well, there are a variety of different ways. And again, there's no direct consistency about that. But a doctoral student of mine, Davydenko, proposed a method where essentially in a particular class of data, we can, so a skew, just for example, we can take the mean absolute value added, sorry, the mean absolute of the final forecast compared, for example, with the mean absolute error from a baseline statistical forecast. Of course, the notion, and an earlier speaker in the session this morning brought this out. Of course, it can be one statistical method compared with another statistical method, or one optimized method compared with the baseline, and so on. So the notion is much more general than actually just applying it to the judgmental adjustment. But I'm going to focus on that. Two different definitions, the Davydenko files one, but also, and this was something I sort of proposed earlier on in a different context, of a relative error measure, where the error, not the mean error or the summed error, but the error from one method is compared observation by observation, and then there's one way or another summed, geometrically summed, a geometric mean, it may be a trimmed mean. The latter has certain advantages over the former in that it's a bit more flexible for small numbers of data, but in fact I do present them both, but they do seem to be programming willing, producing somewhat similar results and certainly similar conclusions. So I measured those two different ways. Now, what I've tried to do, and what I'm in the process of trying to do, is to put together certain the databases that I know could be useful. In 2009, Paul and I looked at 4 companies, 3 manufacturing. Somebody's zipping up here. Philip Hans Francis has 1 company, 7 product groups, something like 36 countries. Van der Broeker and Shari, 3 companies with different product groups in companies. One of the companies has thousands of SKUs. Nikos has a single company database. I hope at some stage, if Nikos is still here, to retrieve it so it can be used. And the advantage of that database is that it's got different lead time forecasts. Also, that was true of Shari's database as well. So extending the database, applying the same selection. These selections have been done sometimes not very clearly of what data to include. We've decided to basically use pretty well all the data, but for each SKU, we'll only use data where we've got 6 or more forecasts, on the grounds that they show a degree of experience for the judgmental forecasters in doing that. Limited drop of low level, that itself is new. So there you've got certain types of summary statistics. Key question, does adjustment add value? Well, for data set 1, and oh, I should add, I've included bias here. I won't go back to the measurement of bias, but that's fairly important. The comparison for these figures is always with 1. Lower than 1 is a good thing. So for bias, you're talking about forecast value added as improving the bias by 26%. So pretty good. Notice the Philip Hans Francis data, which is data set 2, 26,000 observations. Doesn't seem to add any value at all. Data set 3, Shari's data, overall adds value. So sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Usually, on average, by not very much. Well, 15% is certainly worth having. And if you look at company 3 in the 3rd company in Shari's data set, 100% of the products were adjusted, and fabulous forecast value added. It raises the question, what's going on in that company? And Shari's got some analysis of why that is. Of course, part of it may well be that the actual statistical forecast is appalling. So if you've got an appalling statistical forecast, you know it to be appalling. Let's take an obvious example. If you've got a new product growing fast and you're using basic exponential smoothing, then yeah, we certainly would hope that forecast value. But we want that sort of explanation. So from the earlier research, one hypothesis emerged. I don't know if Paul's muted, which is not fair on him, but we sort of tripped over this, that actually positive adjustments, that is to say adjustments upward where the statistical forecast is upgraded, turn out to be much more suspect than negative. Negative turned out, so the information direction was important. And there was also a more speculative hypothesis, which Shari picked up on, about the size of the adjustment. We argued with limited evidence that the size signaled the expert's confidence in the information and confidence that the information was valid. But it could be certain with a very small effect, I note. Whoops. Effects of adjustment direction now. And let's just jump to the conclusions. That the tables are there for me to note. But you'll notice that positive information is pretty terrible, whilst negative information is even helpful with Philip Hans-Francis's data. He didn't analyze the direction of information in his data set analysis. So overall, data set 3, the benefits are less clear. The bias is also improved by adjustment. So that's, in a sense, an important finding in itself, which is not part of the literature. Adjustment size, again, we find positive and negative information going in different directions. Really, for negative information, can you see my pointer? Look, these are really quite substantial figures. These are for large adjustments between 5 and 100% of negative. And suddenly we find, rather curiously, that the forecast value added for 100 above 100, but actually with negative information, it can't be above 100. It can be at 100 if the final forecast is set to 0. So if they set the final forecast to 0, it turns out to be a rather negative decision. So at least some support for the size hypothesis, but little consistency on positive, apart from, as it says, the largest. Let's look at the distribution here. And again, a lot of information in the slide. Look at the punchline. Those are the trimmed adjustment distributions for data set 1 for positive and negative. You actually find that the majority of adjustments for positive information is actually positive forecast value, which is, again, a novel finding. But there are an awful lot of, I've updated this material since I produced it a couple of days ago on a wet Saturday. It's actually the really large adjustments, quite a lot of them have very, very negative consequences. So too many very poor positive adjustments is what turns out to be a problem. So what goes wrong? Optimism bias, over adjustment, lack of consistency in the dynamics, misweighting of the system's forecast, and Photius Petropoulos with Paul and myself looked at the issue of whether a large error is followed by another large error. And again, there's limited support for that. That was with Philip Hans-Francis's data. So I'm carrying that analysis out. So I'm running out of time. Optimism, conclusion. So I'm just going to talk about the conclusions. robust over data sets. That is to say, over adjusting leads to damage. Optimism, well, optimism turns out to be good for negative adjustments, because that means a smaller adjustment, doesn't it? So it's actually over adjustment that the problem occurs. I've started to look now at a rather more difficult problem, responding to past errors. The results here turn out to be company specific. So what I've been able to show so far is the results are general across at least the data sets I've looked at. We've got some more data sets to add in, but actually some elements of it are clearly company specific, with Sherry's company 3 particularly curious. Now let's look at inefficiencies, because this gets down to the core issue. So we can look at inefficiency. We're looking at the relationship between forecast error and the system's forecast and the previous adjustments. And we can put in other cues as well. So the actual, the previous actual lag 1 is a previous cue. Again, this is rather preliminary, definitely work in progress. The explanations of past errors are very limited, and you would get limited improvements. In fact, Philip Hans Francis got no improvement from actually using models like this. Paul and I got some positive benefits, but not particularly high. So there are general issues there. Unfortunately, data set 3 is not suitable. We've lost key bits of information there. So we'll pass on that. Now,
4 minutes, Robert.
Thank you. Yeah, just finishing now. The alert amongst you might have noticed I've changed the title. The proper title of this presentation was What We Should Know About Forecast Value Added. What have we learned so far from this trip through these 3 data sets? Well, there are various characteristic biases, such as optimism. They lead to poorer or sometimes negative forecast value added. But what do we need to know? We need to identify the skew level characteristics that are that add forecast value added. So I don't know whether any of you heard Jeff Baker's presentation. He was looking at that. It's an article to come out in Foresight with a degree of commentary from Mike Gilliland and myself on that. But crucially, we need to know what levers there are to guide or alternatively restrict adjustments. And we don't have any recommendations as how we can downweight or change adjustments. We have no mechanisms into software that would do that. So actually, we know increasingly, and hopefully by the time we finish this, which will be sometime, I guess, in the early new year, depending on COVID and weather, we know quite a lot about adjustments, or will do, but actually what we don't know is the crucial question. How can we achieve better forecast value added? It's related to perhaps the developing more complex models where causal drivers in demand systems are part of the model and how that links. But as we'll discover from Anna shortly, that issue is not undermining of the notion in principle. And there we are. There's my alarm going off. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Robert. We have a minute for a question, if anyone wants to jump in.
Well, just perhaps a comment, Robert. You say in some companies, like as in the paper with Photius, there's a response to the previous error, and in others there isn't. I mean, this may well depend upon whether they actually track the accuracy of their previous forecasts, of course. There's some evidence that some companies never bother with accuracy calculations or never bother to look back or monitor the forecasts. And maybe in the companies where there's no response, they don't even know what the previous error was.
Yeah, that's the previous error can be presented in a lot of different ways, can't it?
Indeed.
And yes, it needs to be salient. It needs to hammer them in there in the face, because these demand forecasts are actually dealing with quite a lot of products. So one way or another, they've got to have software which forces it to their attention. I think that's right.
Indeed. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, this is time for a presentation from Sinan Gönül from Newcastle Business School, North Cumbria University. Sinan, you have presenter slides. Are you aware of these?
Yes, yes. I'm just trying to get ready, but I hope everyone is able to see the slides.
I guess so. If it's okay for you, then
yes, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Anna and Sherry for organizing this session. So what I will be talking about today is when and why can scenarios be harmful for judgmental demand forecasts and following production order decisions. This is joint research by Paul and Dilek. And here's my agenda for today. This is actually continuation of the research that I started presenting in last year's ISF. And that research was basically on investigating judgmental produced demand forecasts with the help of scenarios. And we were using these judgmentally produced scenarios for production decisions. What are production decisions? Basically, let's say you have a portfolio of products, around 5 to 6 products, and then you have a total manufacturing capacity, and you need to distribute that total manufacturing capacity into those products and decide how many to produce from each. So in more detail, in that research, what we have looked at, how people can first generate demand forecasts by using time series information in the presence of worst and best case scenarios. So once these judgmental demand forecasts are produced, then how can they be translated into actual production decisions? A brief background, as we know, when we forecast practitioners want to produce demand forecasts, they are likely to access 2 different sources of information. One is time series information in the form of graphs or data series of past demand, and the other one is a contextual information that can be in various forms. One of those contextual information forms that are popular over the last years are scenarios. As we are all debating, they can provide quite colorful narratives about possible features. And through that colorful narratives, Dilek will also talk about scenarios in her presentation next. It challenges managerial thinking. It acts as, okay, there's these possibilities, so how I need to consider them in my judgment forecast as well, sort of behavior. So we are trying to understand this scenario behavior and how it affects the judgment forecast formation. They have been there for a quite long time, especially in the area of strategy formation. So what does typical forecasters do? They just integrate, takes the time series information of past demand, takes the contextual information, whether it's in scenarios or other format, combine them, produce demand forecasts, and then by using these demand forecasts, produce the production decisions. But we all know judgmental forecasts are prone to so many different biases. For example, one of them is there is a tendency of the decision makers to overweigh recent observations. Another judgmental bias that we see is we tend to produce very narrow judgmental intervals, which basically means judgmental forecasters are generally overconfident, or it can be also connect to hyper-precision effects. Another one, optimism bias, as Robert also mentioned about why adjustments were not always adding value. Of course, scenarios in that case might be helpful against overcoming or at least reducing the effects of some of those judgmental biases. So we looked at more into these scenarios in this research. But for the time series we have used, they were artificially created. There were two main purposes for us to produce to use artificially produced time series data. One of them is we needed to have untrended series, basically. And then we needed to control for high noise and low noise series. 6 series, they are all untrended, half with high noise and 3 with low noise. And then here was our generating function. 125, the base signal value plus an error which was normally distributed with zero mean and the standard deviation of either 10% or 20%. So our second purpose was having a very clear signal value so that we can use that signal value of 125 in determining the production capacity. So what we did, we provided the 6 products, 6 time series plots. They were 20 weeks long, and we asked to generate a point forecast for the 21st period. And then we asked them for the confidence rating, and later on we asked them to make a production decision. Okay, you have generated your forecast, and then you need to allocate this into the 6 products, so it's your production decision. In this way, we ask people to translate their forecast into actual actions. And how did we calculate the total production capacity? We have asked them for 6 products, and then there is the signal value baseline demand, which is 125. So we set the production capacity at 750. There were 3 experimental groups. The first group just received the time series graph only, no scenarios. The second group received both the best case and worst case scenario. So they have seen 2 scenarios of the opposite polarity, but they were sort of more vague, meaning more weakly worded. And the third group, again, they have seen both the best case and worst case scenarios, but they had more strong wording. This was a sample form that we used. As you can see, we have the time series graph of 20 periods. We asked forecast for the 21st period. And we had these scenarios, scenario A and B. Actually, we didn't tell to the participants which one was worst case and which one was best case. We just labeled as generic. And then scenario A in this case was best case and B was the worst case. And about the word strong versus weak, you can just see, for example, in scenario A, the last sentence, given the recent economic conditions, we strongly expect even higher demand for this product in the periods to come. So that strongly expect, the strong word was not existing in the other version of scenario A, which was mentioned as weakly worded. And in the strongly worded one, we had such adjectives used in various parts of the scenario. But we asked first the point forecast, a confidence rating, and then the production decision. So anything between 0 and 750. And we also reminded that your total production capacity is limited by this ceiling value. Therefore, your production orders for all 6 products should add up to a maximum 750. And they can go back and forth between the products. So once they have created their forecast, they can then adjust their production decisions accordingly. So it had that chance. What were our main findings? About forecast accuracy. As can be expected, judgmental point forecasts that are produced by the participants were quite less accurate than this Forecast Pro produce forecasts. So once again, we have seen some evidence that judgmental forecasting were not adding much value to their point forecasts generated. But this was quite expected. Actually, it's simply because we had used artificial time series and there was a perfect signal value. So Forecast Pro software, by using optimized algorithms, were able to catch that signal value almost perfectly. Hence, it was a very big challenge for the participants to surpass that level of accuracy. So in this case, this is more or less what can be expected. But what was unexpected was the scenarios value. Contrary to our findings in our previous research, where scenarios were adding sort of value to the accuracy, here scenarios worsened the the forecast accuracy. So the groups receiving the scenarios produce less accurate point forecasts. What about the decision quality? Well, because scenarios led to less accurate point forecast, this in turn reflected in the production level decisions. So the production level decisions, if you can see the small graph, aside from this outlier value in the lower right hand corner with the blue diamond, the blue diamond is the first group. As you can see, the majority of the blue diamond points are closer to the efficient frontier. So the group who received no scenarios produce production decisions much closer to their normative values. On the other hand, the other two groups receiving scenarios, the red squares or the yellow triangles, were further away from optimality. So the less accurate point forecasts were translated into less accurate production or less optimal production decisions. So the main question was that we haven't looked at, or we haven't talked about last year, was why did the scenarios lead to inaccurate point forecasts? To understand the reasons behind, we have run a generalized estimating equations model. We have chosen this model to accommodate for the repeated measures nature of the experiment, because each participant made 6 forecasts which were interdependent among a single decision maker. What was our dependent variable? Point forecast generated minus 125, the signal value. It can be verbally translated as the error in estimating the signal. And our independent variables were the last observation minus the mean of the series, sort of the last movement or the last segment slope in the series. And then 2 dummy variables to capture one, if the scenarios were provided or not, and another dummy to check whether there is the high noise or the low noise series. And of course, we included 2-way interactions between A and B, B and C, and A and C. And this was the ANOVA table produced. Basically, as you can see from the ANOVA table, we had 3 independent variables to have significant effects. First of all was the last observation minus the series mean. The last segment slope had a significant positive effect to the point forecast produced. And similarly, we had positive effects from the interaction of this last segment slope with the scenarios provided and high noise. So what to make of this of these results? First of all, it simply means a positive value for the last observation or coefficient value for last observation minus series mean is simply most recent observations were overweighted. So the latest observation, if it was over the series mean, translated into a high point forecast, or if the latest observation was below the series mean, a downward slope, it translated to a point forecast that was too low. And moreover, the positive coefficient of the significant interaction effect means that when there were scenarios, this bias was exaggerated. So the scenarios were damaging the point forecast accuracy by increasing the tendency of the forecasters to overweigh the most recent observations. There was that tendency anyway, but scenarios just worsened the condition. But another dimension to this finding was the presence of both scenarios in both groups. So both of the groups 2 and 3 saw worst case and best case scenarios at the same time. However, seeing that basically the scenario that was consistent with the latest moment was given the attention. So in an upward sloping last segment, when the last observation was about the serious mean, it was consistent with the best case scenario. Or a downward sloping last segment was consistent with the worst case scenario. So some general discussion. How can we make sense of these findings? Basically, it can only mean that when people are generating their forecasts, they had too much weight on the last segment slope, and also they were using scenarios for justification. So if there was an upward movement, then they were heeding more attention to the best case scenario, which was consistent simply because that best case scenario provided them sort of an explanation why there will be better times. So they produce even higher forecasts. Similarly, a worst case scenario basically allowed people to have some explanation for the fall in the last segment. And then having read that as a justification for their judgment, they even lowered further their point forecasts. But this occurred despite the additional presence of the opposite polarity scenario. So they were using one scenario and discounting the conflicting scenario. But was this a sort of a conscious effect that they are purposefully attending only one scenario but not the other? No. In the exit questionnaire, people were very happy to receive both scenarios, both the worst case and best case. So they rate them both, but unconsciously, they discounted one and leaned towards the other. Here was what we found in the exit questionnaire data. Basically, we asked them to provide their agreement ratings with these statements. 1 being disagree strongly, 5 means agree strongly. And as you can see, all these ratings are strictly above 4, meaning they agreed that scenarios were very useful and they were very happy to receive both scenarios. All right, now, what next? Basically, this research was quite efficient in showing that the effects of scenarios are not always positive, and the benefit of scenario is circumstantial. And there's an interaction with the time series features of the underlying data and the scenarios. And we need to have specifically designed experiments to understand how does that interaction work, and how can we use scenarios more effectively to reduce the biases or judgmental biases of the decision makers. And another point is that why is there a gap, and how can we reduce the gap of perceived usefulness merit of receiving the scenarios, because everyone is happy to receive them, versus their real use and merit.
1 minute, Sinan, sorry.
So thank you very much.
I could have waited a second.
No problem.
Okay, any questions? Thank you very much, Sinan, for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, could I ask a question, I suppose, based on your work, Anna? Sinan, should the scenarios have had any effect?
Well, should they have any effect? Again, I believe this is in the circumstantial nature, Robert. I mean, I strongly believe that in certain aspects they will have an effect because it's a nice piece of contextual information. Moreover, they sort of make people think about different alternatives. So they should have an effect in their forecasting procedure. But will they always have an effect? I believe no. That's also part of the puzzle. We need to understand how scenarios interact with judgment forecasting in certain aspects, as well as when they are effective and when they are completely ignored or they have no value.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have enough time for continuing this discussion. So Dilek Onkal is the next presenter from North Cumbria University again.
Thank you. Anna, if you could confirm that you are seeing my screen.
Not yet, but it's coming. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you after all this time and after all the things that are happening in the world. And thanks to Anna and Sherry for organizing this session. I'm going to talk about basically along similar lines that Sinan has said, again, about judgmental adjustments and scenario use, and with respect to the differences between individual and group forecasts this time. And this is, of course, joint work with Sinan Gönül and Paul Goodwin. So scenarios are powerful tools, we know, for constructing various futures, for thinking about pathways leading to these futures, and they've been used in corporate strategy and planning since the early 1960s. And we know that they support planning for the range of plausible uncertainties, and they also challenge managerial thinking. Also, through Cairns, Goodwin, and Wright Cairns' work, we know that they can help predict and analyze stakeholder behavior. So they have strong links to decision analysis. Scenarios can also help with problems due to cognitive biases, a very important contribution that Wright and Goodwin have noted. And they may also be perceived to be more credible by users in comparison to dull and dry statistical numbers, which is extremely important for things like trust in forecasts and so on. So when we bring scenarios into forecasting, we may argue that through offering structured storylines of plausible futures, scenarios are very important in promoting future-focused thinking. They offer collaborative pathways for information sharing. They facilitate communication among stakeholders, among providers, users of forecasts, and people who are impacted by them. They provide a platform to formally recognize the uncertainties, which is tremendously important, as we've seen with COVID and the related scenarios. And furthermore, they enable forecasting agility. So scenarios can be used to support the construction and revision of forecasts. So it's not just about constructing the forecast, but it's also about updating them. And we also have shown that they do enhance the trust in forecasts. So rather than just giving dry forecasts by themselves, if alternative scenarios could also be presented with the forecast, that enhances the decision makers' trust in the given forecast, which is quite important. So given that background, our overall research interest is in examining the role of scenarios in judgmental forecasting and predictive analytics. Our research focus in the studies that I'm going to talk about now has to do with investigating the effects of providing multiple scenarios as forecast advice on individual and group-based judgmental predictions. There have been a series of studies, that have laid the groundwork for that. In the technological forecasting and social change study, we talked about optimistic and pessimistic scenarios, and we have shown that they could be utilized effectively as channels of forecasting advice in individual and group prediction tasks. And we've shown that scenario availability reduced the size of judgmental adjustments, which is quite important on the acceptance of model forecasts that are given. Sinan summarized our European Journal of Operational Research work very well, so I'm not going to go into the details of that other than to say scenarios were found to be effective in reducing overconfidence and potentially damaging effect of scenarios depending on whether the participants' focus on the scenario was congruent with the most recent behavior of the time series or not. Our JBDM study found a contrast effect in looking at scenarios. In particular, when asked to judge the implications of a best case scenario, participants made forecasts that were more positive if they also had access to a worst case scenario, and vice versa. When asked to judge the implications of a worst case scenario, participants made forecasts that were more negative if they also had access to a best case scenario. So given all that, the current work takes a summary, if you will, of the findings and tries to apply them to what we call scenario dilution. And the study design is similar in that we have the individual forecast in phase 1 and the consensus forecast in phase 2. These consensus forecasts are given by two-person teams or dyads. And we are looking to see what happens, whether the scenario effect is diluted or not as a result of it. And I'll go into the details in just a bit. So we have two phases. In phase 1, we have individual forecasts. Participants are given 18 time series plots that show past demand for mobile phones, model-based point forecasts, and scenarios in addition to that. And then they're asked to make their individual predictions using point forecasts, as well as best case forecasts, worst case forecasts, and hit probability that the actual demand will be between their best case and worst case forecasts. Again, we used the practitioner's approach to making forecasts and what appealed to them as part of their naturalistic environment when scenarios were present in deciding on what forecasting formats to use and what to elicit, basically. So this is a sample example, just a sample form, sorry. We have a product D, let's say, whose demand is given over 20 time periods. We also gave a model-based forecast for the next period. So period 21 has a basic model-based forecast. We are also going to give them a scenario in this situation. For example, they're given a worst case scenario, and then we ask for their forecast with respect to the point forecast, best case, worst case forecast, and what's the probability that the actual demand will be between their best case and worst case forecasts. So that's the first phase. The second phase, we assign the participants to two-person teams. Each participant is provided with a consensus forecast form that includes the same 18 time series plots that they got, the same model-based forecasts, plus their corresponding scenarios from phase 1. And they're requested to discuss the given model-based forecast, past demands, and scenarios as a dyad. That's the catch of it. They are to share, basically, their scenarios because their plots are the same, model-based forecasts are the same, they're given different scenarios, as we'll talk about in different experiments. They are to discuss their scenarios which are different from one another, share them, argue about them, and then arrive at consensus forecasts in these three formats again: point, best case, worst case, and the dyad's hit probability assessments for each of the 18 products. Upon completing the consensus forecasts, we also wanted to know what their preferred individual predictions would have happened. So they do their individual predictions, they talk about it in dyads, arrive at consensus forecasts, and then individually, privately, confidentially, they report what their preferred individual predictions would have happened, right? So the actual question was this switch between the individual to consensus to what was actually their preferred individual predictions and what changed, what didn't. So this is what the form looked like. So the consensus forecasts in different formats. And then once they filled that out, then their individual forecasts, the forecast that they would have preferred to give after the sharing of that information. There are two studies. I don't think I will have time to talk about both of them, so I'll just start with the study one. In the individual forecast, there were 4 groups. First group only got the weak optimistic scenarios, and they were given the time series plots, model-based forecasts, and weak optimistic scenarios that were labeled as best case scenarios. And we had 31 individuals there. Group 2, instead of weak optimistic, they got strong optimistic scenarios. Group 3 got weak pessimistic scenarios. Group 4 got strong pessimistic scenarios, right? That's in the individual forecasts. In the second phase, after they gave their initial forecast, in the second phase, we put different participants together into 4 groups. X1 was the one member had the weak optimistic scenario, the other member had the weak pessimistic scenario. In group X2, one had the weak optimistic, the other had strong pessimistic. X3, strong optimistic was combined with weak pessimistic, and X4 had the strong optimistic combined with strong pessimistic scenario. We looked at different performance measures. We looked at the percentage change in point forecast. We looked at the percentage change in best case, percentage change in worst case forecast. Then we looked at the absolute differences. We also looked at the expected hit rate and asymmetry ratio. So we looked at the overall direction of the adjustments and the overall magnitude of the adjustments in addition to the expected hit rate and the asymmetry ratio. What were some of the findings? If we were to start with the way they perceived the scenarios, what were their assessment of different dimensions of the scenarios that were given to them? Actually, there were no significant differences among the groups for any of the assessment dimensions. It didn't matter whether scenarios were optimistic or pessimistic, or whether the tone was weak or strong. They believed that the scenarios actually contributed something. They found them realistic, found them clear to understand, useful for constructing forecasts, that it enhanced their future-focused thinking and provided important information to them. And that's just a radar graph summarizing that. When it comes to performance measures, I won't go into the details, but for individual forecasts, the ones that they gave at phase 1, at the very beginning, when they just got the plots, the model forecast, and one particular scenario that they were assigned with. We found significant main effects of the outlook, so whether they were given optimistic or pessimistic scenarios made a difference in their actual judgmental adjustments, and the significant main effect of tone strength was also found. So whether they were weak or strong was exceptionally important in the performance measures. After they arrived at the consensus, for their consensus forecast, we found significant interaction effect between the strength of optimism and strength of pessimism. Maybe more importantly, I'd like to talk about the forecast shifts that we looked at. We looked at two forecast shifts. Shift one is the shift from individual forecast before any group discussion, individual forecast at phase one, going to phase two, in which they sit down, share their forecast, discuss it among themselves, and then arrive at a consensus. That shift we found had all kinds of interesting effects. For point forecasts, to start with, individuals that were given optimistic scenarios all reduced their point forecast for consensus across all groups. And so those with optimistic scenarios reduced their point forecast when they actually shared the forecast of the opposite direction. Individuals given pessimistic scenarios all increased their point forecast for the consensus, right? So that shift going from individual to consensus in point forecast was all effective with respect to whether they started with the optimistic or the pessimistic. The discussion phase, the consensus, arriving at the consensus phase after sharing their scenarios did make a difference. For the worst case forecast, if you were to look at the worst case forecast that they gave and the shift there, overall there was difference in adjustment after group discussion. So optimistic reduced their worst case forecast for consensus, and pessimistic increased their worst case forecast for consensus. So once again, the group discussion had made an effect on the forecasts for point forecast as well as for worst case forecast. For best case forecast, however, only the group that got the strong optimistic and strong pessimistic combination, we found a difference in the adjustment after the group discussion. Then we looked at their forecast shift two, individual forecast before group discussion to the preferred individual forecast after group discussion. We found that group discussion and scenario communication appeared to be more effective for individuals getting optimistic tone scenarios, and individuals receiving pessimistic tone scenarios preferred forecasts that were close to their initial forecast. I'll just go over these. These are tracking the point forecast as measured by percentage change from model-based predictions. And you can see across all groups a change from individual to consensus, and then some slight changes going from consensus onwards depending on the group. What are the implications for forecast management? Scenarios may be used as effective forecast advice to do various things, to challenge mental frames, tunnel vision in decision making, the bias against overconfidence, confirmation bias, desirability bias, hindsight bias, and so on, as well as to counteract future myopia and retrospective sense making. This optimism-pessimism balance seems to be exceptionally important, though. The whole thing will definitely depend on the forecasting and scenario use across different organizational contexts. Different group sizes and the group processes will need to be looked at, and the scenarios constructed by different stakeholders, forecasters, experts, collaboratively, etc., all deserve to be investigated, and the user's perspective, how to assess the scenario quality, remains definitely very important. One last word, and if I may, just said in our latest paper with Sherry that the turbulence surrounding COVID-19 presents a productive living and learning laboratory that highlights how constructing scenarios are not sufficient if they do not translate to forecasts and actions. For example, the World Economic Forum with their global risks report from 2007 onwards, at least since I've been following them, emphasized the risk of a major global pandemic, highlighting countries are underprepared for them, but no, those scenarios have not been translated into forecasts and actions, and that is the real important bit of scenario forecast that interaction that I think we need to be focusing on. So the act of writing a scenario may actually make a tail event more real as a possibility, drawing in attention to the importance of its forecast. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dilek, for your presentation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I propose if anyone wants to ask any questions, maybe we can leave session running after all the presentations, so we can have a discussion as well.
Or they can always email me as well.
Emails or even Move app allows you to message. Okay, the next presentation is actually our first student presentation, and this is my presentation, to be honest. So I would encourage you to rate this presentation afterwards if you can. That would be great. And let me share my screen. Yeah. Do you see my screen? Right? Everything.
Yes.
And Shari, can I ask you to?
You can see it perfect, Anna.
Yeah, cool. Nika, so Shari, as a host, can you let me know when it will be, like 5 minutes and 1 minute before the time is running out? Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining our session. My name is Anna Stroginis, and I'm a PhD student at Lancaster University. And today I'm going to present this judgmental model tuning versus conventional adjustments based on a case study. And this work is done with my supervisors, Professor Nicholas Kurenzis and Professor Robert Fields. We all know here that human judgment plays an important role in forecasting process. And according to Petropoulos 2019, a foresight paper, Photios, you had an amazing graph there, diagram, so I used it. And basically, this diagram specifies the steps where judgment could play a role in the forecasting process. So, and we see that the last research have been focusing on the last two steps. So basically producing judgmentally forecasts, we call it pure judgmental forecasting, or we actually can also look at the adjusting and correcting statistical outcomes, so judgmental adjustments. But in the main paper of Petropoulos 2018, they focus on judgmental model selection. So it's basically the second step in this diagram. But we came across of the case of parameterization of the model. So we will talk about the third step. So what is the judgmental parameterization of model in this case? To explore this, I will start with the general overview of the case study. So it is based on UK retailer with around 50,000 SKUs and 400 stores. They do use SAP FNR system for their forecasts, where they keep around 2 years of weekly data, and along with their events and promotions for this data. And this system model actually includes these promotional dummies. So as we know, this is based on regression. So these promotional dummies and events can be included. But what do we see in the end? That around 60% of all SKUs are being adjusted in the end. And also all this contextual information that influence these adjustments, such as weather, revision of promotions, special events, and so on, or COVID, for example, right now, it's actually handled outside of the system. And hence, I actually see 2 steps where these experts can incorporate their judgment. So I transformed this diagram a bit, trying to identify where we can actually influence this process. So as you can see, system is responsible for defining a set of models, and we don't know what is that, and selecting a model as well, parameterizing the model and producing forecasts, while judgment actually can come at 2 stages. So we either can parameterize the model or finalize forecasts. And in this case, what we mean by parameterizing the model, it's actually adding dummy variables for special events and conditions at the modeling stage. So basically what experts do, they see that, okay, we know this week will have such event, and they want to incorporate this dummy into the system, so system will run model with this dummy and evaluating accordingly. So we call this process judgmental model tuning, because it's not parameterization per se. It's not like done how it could be done in exponential smoothing, for example. And the second part, of course, it is traditional part, so conventional adjustments that are manual adjustments to the system forecast at the final stage. So several advantages and disadvantages that might come up with this judgmental model tuning, right? So first of all, it's highly efficient, or could be highly efficient, because it's easy to implement in the system. It's easily scalable, so you could implement these dummies for many SKUs at once and for many stores at once as well. And also we know that when the model is actually a filter for these adjustments, we know that it could actually avoid direct human biases that we know from psychology literature. And in this case, it could be a really good advantage of this process. Also, there are some drawbacks of this, right? So first of all, we could overfit to the noise. We could include too many variables, basically, and the model could be overwhelmed with these variables. And here we have a question, but do forecasters identify these additional factors correctly? Do they include these factors that actually can play a role in the modeling part? So, and let's get back to the company case. What we see there, that they have 2 types of dummies in the system. One is promotions, of course, and they are planned and available in forecasting support system. Events dummy, however, is actually judgmentally selected and incorporated specifically for specific weeks, and could be done for specific SKUs as well. And adjustments, of course, and here it's percentage change to the final forecast. You could have guessed that we have a problem here. We could have actually a double expert judgment here. So it's the same period could be adjusted twice. First at the modeling stage, so additional dummy will give some weight to this event, and then at the end of the process, so at the final stage, we could actually correct this forecast again. So there is a danger of this double expert judgment. And let's have a look at the descriptives and at the scale of these different levels of adjustments, as we might call them. So the data that we have is actually highly intermittent data. Around 77% of all actuals are zeros, approximately the same for forecasts. So we already have a problem with averages and median sales. So median forecast will prefer zero forecast. You also can observe that promotions are taking around 6 to 9% of all observations. So this is a table for 24 weeks only for specific number of SKUs per store. And events take around 35% of all these observations. So we can see that events are easily scalable. So they could be implemented for different SKUs, but at the same, for different stores at the same time. So it's much easier to implement it in practice. And yeah, one note here that promotions are typically done locally. So they are done for specific SKU and for a specific store, while events are done globally, which means that they are correcting SKU for each, for all stores in the company. And also one note here that 50% of all local adjustments are done during promotional periods. So this is exactly this issue that I was describing a slide before. So the danger of double forecasting. So in this case, local adjustments and promotions are interacting, and these events are being adjusted twice, basically. And the same goes to the global adjustments. We have around a third of all global adjustments done for events observations. But let's have a look at accuracy, actually. So I mentioned that we have actuals, we have final forecasts for this company, but we don't have system forecasts. And we have dummies for different conditions. So all these local, global events, promotions, and so on. So it is possible to recreate the forecast, but it won't be accurate or as accurate as it is in the system. So we used actually an average of past sales as a benchmark for forecast error evaluation. And in this case, we used trimmed geometric errors, actually for the same reason that Robert was explaining a couple of presentations before that it has better distribution and actually performed quite well. But in this case also it helps with the distribution. So mean and median doesn't perform well. So just a couple of notes. I know that this table is quite big. So just a couple of rows that I want to highlight here. Look at the distribution of global adjustments and local adjustments. And you can see that actually global adjustments are implemented quite widely compared to local. And the same goes for the events and promotions. So the number of events that are being written or marked in the system is actually huge for this data set. So, and you also can compare these relative absolute errors or relative squared errors. And for local adjustment and global adjustments, we see that local adjustments are actually performing better than global adjustments. While for events and promotions, the accuracy is more or less the same. So there is no significant increase in accuracy for events, for example, in this particular case. The other thing that I want to mention is a comparison of negative and positive adjustment in this case. So if you look at these highlighted rows again, you can actually see, and this supports evidence from Robert's presentation again, that negative adjustments are actually much more accurate than positive adjustment. But at the same time, if you see number of adjustments that have been done for non-promotional modeling, you see that positive adjustments are actually prevailing. So there are a lot of positive adjustments for these cases, and they're actually not really beneficial for the accuracy. So we looked at the descriptive, but let's have a look at the relationship between these variables. So how actually the number of adjustments, different adjustments, can influence relative absolute and mean absolute error. In this case, it's mean absolute error. So just a couple of notes from this table, you can see that a number of local adjustments in any case, either positive or negative, actually reduce relative mean absolute error, which means that local adjustments are quite helpful in this particular case. So again, I will remind, local adjustments are done for SKU and for store specifically. So it's much harder to make these adjustments. So I can actually assume that people and these demand planners know more about these adjustments, about these SKUs for these adjustments to make them to make these adjustments. As for global adjustments, we actually see that global negative adjustments are beneficial for their accuracy, but while positive
5 more minutes, Anna, 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much. And also events, you see that events, actually the number of events, so when we include events in our data, we actually see the effect of reducing error, which is quite interesting compared to the descriptors that we've seen just a minute ago. But one point here, which is quite important, that all the interactions, apart from the last one, actually reduce accuracy, which means that this danger of double expert judgment is actually viable. So basically, we see that when they adjust first as a dummy, and then when experts incorporate their judgment again at the final stage, is actually not beneficial at all. So in this case, we actually let's look at the efficiency of this model tuning. So can forecasters identify events correctly? To analyze this, we looked at the residuals of unaided system model for non-promotional periods and with regards to binary events. And here are some results. So basically, you don't need to analyze all these results, but basically what we found that only 4 out of 14 factors that have been included in the system in our sample, so around 30%, are identified correctly. So there is also a problem of having too many variables included in the system that could actually overload the model itself. So just finalizing quickly. So what do we see from this case study? We see 2 types of judgmental adjustments, local and global. We see also 2 types of judgmental model tuning conditions, events and promotions in this case. And we know that actually judgmental model tuning could be an efficient way of making adjustments. First of all, a regression as a filter can identify means and estimate means much better than a human. And we know this from psychology literature again. And also, it's easier for humans to add this contextual information so that it can't be actually easily identified by model as timing variables. So it's actually really handy in terms of adding your judgment to the model. But there is a danger of this double expert judgment. And what we see that as a general note here, that negative adjustments are better than positive. And we see this not on the first data set. Also, we see that local adjustments that been done for specific SKU in specific store perform better than global. And this is quite obvious, right? Because basically on global level, we generalize all these adjustments. We also see that judgmental model tuning increases accuracy, but not substantially. And we see that double expert adjustments harm accuracy on average as well. So a couple of questions that I want to finish with is what to do with that. You know, first of all, we want to help this process, right? And I wonder, and this is actually questions for future research, how we can assess this process correctly, especially when we know that there are several levels of these adjustments, and when we know that this is sort of hierarchical problem as well in terms of adjustments, in terms of interventions into the statistical forecasts. So should we post-process them more often, or should we evaluate judgmental model tuning more often as well, restrict double expert adjustments somehow through the systems, and so on. So here I will actually finish. We have 1 minute for questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Matthew. Yeah.
Yep. So first, thanks for the presentation. I enjoyed it. Question. So you said these adjustments affect forecasting accuracy. Do you have any sense of including dummies, because you said it was a regression, that it might also affect insights on, let's say, pricing? Because typically in these models, they might also include price to predict sales.
I have a quick answer to this. We don't have prices for this company, unfortunately. Oh, okay. So we can't, like, even in theory, we can't include. But at the same time, on average, I would say, like, yeah, it might be beneficial to include prices, but at the same time, also, yeah, you need to be careful with that. But yeah, in this case, we can't physically do that, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thanks.
Sorry for this. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Any other questions? Oh, actually, sorry for that. Let me remind quickly. Can you read this presentation, please, in Wova? And the next presenter is Paul Goodwin. I will finish sharing my slides. Yeah, Shari, could you help me with the video, please?
Yes, I'm starting it up. Just give me a sec.
Excellent. So the next presenter is Paul Goodwin, and we have a recording of his presentation, but Paul Goodwin is here to answer your questions. So please do ask them.
Okay, it should be visible by now.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Paul Goodwin from the University of Bath, and I want to present in this talk some research I've done with Robert Files of the Lancaster Forecasting Centre at Lancaster University. It's some research that we've conducted in a pharmaceutical company. We've called the talk Stability in the Suboptimal Use of Forecasting Systems, a case study in a supply chain company. We're trying to answer 2 research questions. First, why did staff in a supply chain company make suboptimal use of their forecasting software? They spent quite a bit of money on the software, so why weren't they using it to its full potential? And the second question, why did this situation persist for many years? First of all, I need to define what suboptimality is, or indeed what optimality is. So I'm going to ask, first of all, what does the forecasting literature tell us about the way that forecasting systems should be used? What is the normative approach to the use of forecasting systems? Well, first of all, the literature tells us that managers should use appropriate statistical forecasting methods to identify regular patterns in data. By appropriate methods, we mean, for example, not using simple exponential smoothing where you've got a trend or a seasonal pattern. And we think that people should use statistical forecasting methods to identify patterns because people have cognitive biases when searching for patterns in data. They see false patterns where there are none. So statistical forecasting methods are more likely to identify the true systematic patterns within past data. Secondly, judgmental adjustments should only be applied to statistical forecasts when the forecaster has important information that's not available to the statistical method. People shouldn't make trivial adjustments. Only important information justifies interventions. Thirdly, the adjustment should only account for the extra information. If the statistical method has already taken account of new information, then there's a danger of double counting if further judgmental adjustments are made to reflect that information. Fourthly, the rationale for any adjustment should be recorded. There are two reasons for this. The first is that if we keep records of why we made adjustments, we can learn which reasons justified interventions and which reasons didn't. And secondly, there's evidence that asking people to provide a documented rationale for why they adjusted a forecast tends to prevent them from making gratuitous adjustments, trivial adjustments for no real purpose. Fifthly, decisions about statistical methods, which to choose, for example, or the length of series history to fit the method to, these should be informed as far as possible by analysing historic data and past forecast accuracy. We should look for evidence that a given statistical method should be chosen. Why, therefore, do people often deviate from normative practice according to the literature? Well, statistical forecasts may be subject to too many adjustments that aren't justified, because, first of all, people have false perceptions of systematic movements in time series noise. People see the up and down movements in a graph, and they begin to see systematic patterns in these, when really these movements are only random, they're only noise. But people make adjustments because they think the statistical method has missed a meaningful pattern, in fact, where there is none. Secondly, there's often a lack of trust in statistical models. There's a term called algorithm aversion, where people trust the judgment of human beings far more than they trust the recommendations or forecasts of an algorithm. And people often believe that random errors are avoidable. So when an algorithm doesn't pick them up, they can't see why. I've heard tales of some senior managers asking their forecasters, why aren't your forecasts 100% accurate? Not understanding, of course, that random errors can't be predicted. Thirdly, political demands. Many forecasts are political. People change forecasts to please their boss, or they change forecasts to gain more resources for their department, for example. They don't truly believe what the changed forecast is predicting. They change the forecast for political reasons. Fourthly, there's often a need for a sense of ownership of forecasts. If I'm an expert in my market, an expert in my products, I need to see that reflected in the forecasts. I need to have a feeling that I own those forecasts. I may also make adjustments to justify my role. For example, if I turn up every day and simply press the button on the computer to produce the automated forecasts, managers may begin to ask, well, what purpose am I serving? I'm not using my expertise in any way to try and improve those forecasts. And finally, there's a fear of being de-skilled through automation. Managers may feel that if they're constantly being replaced by automated forecasts, they will leave the skills and knowledge that they've developed in making forecasts, in using their expertise to produce forecasts. What about the company where we did the research, and how did we gather the data? Well, the company is a UK subsidiary of an American pharmaceutical company based in the south of England. We made visits to the company's headquarters over a period of around 6 months. At the first visit, we were given a presentation by the company's managers about their forecasting system, followed by questions and answers. We observed 2 meetings where the forecasts were finalized. These are called review meetings. More about those later. We conducted semi-structured interviews with the main participants in the forecasting process. We attended 2 user conferences run by the software supplier. And we obtained over 5,000 forecasts, adjustments, and outcomes. So how were the forecasts actually made? Well, forecasts of demand, as I've just said, were made for up to 2 months, 1 month ahead and 2 months ahead. First of all, a logistics manager cleaned the sales history to remove the effects of stockouts on sales. The person knew a demand that had been unfulfilled and was therefore able to adjust the sales history to turn it into a demand history. Then this person used the system to produce the baseline forecasts based on trend extrapolations. But they didn't always use the automated forecast produced by the software's algorithm. Here's a quote from one of the logistics managers. I'd actually remodel the statistical forecast using different lengths of past history, different levels, different trends, and try and make or use the system to generate a more, what's the word I'm looking for? A more reasonable forecast. In other words, they manipulated the forecast, they changed the parameter values, they changed the history that was being used to estimate the model until they got a forecast that they thought was reasonable. Effectively, it was judgmental forecasting by the back door, adjusting the forecast until they got one that they wanted. Then in the third stage, the baseline forecasts were presented at a forecast review meeting. There were 17 of these a month throughout the company. It took an awful lot of time. And here the committee, looking at a screen which presented the past history and the current baseline forecast, made judgmental adjustments to take into account market intelligence, much of it coming from accounts managers. Well, how accurate were these adjustments? Well, there were no records of the automated forecast that the software will have produced. Only the manipulated forecasts were recorded. So we tried to simulate what the automatic forecasts would have been. And you can see there's not much difference in accuracy between the manipulated forecasts and what we think the software would have predicted had it been allowed to make the forecasts automatically. But as a caveat here, we only had 2 years worth of data to produce those simulated automatic forecasts. A longer sales history, a long demand history would probably have made those forecasts more accurate. But the message there is that manipulation was primarily a waste of valuable management time. Had they pressed the automatic button, they would probably have done just as well. What about the adjustments at the review meetings for market intelligence? Well, we divided the adjustments into positive, where the forecast was increased, and negative, where they were lowered. And you can see that the forecast value added when the positive adjustments were made was negative. Positive adjustments reduced accuracy. Only negative adjustments, on average, improved accuracy. So much of the time was wasted in making adjustments that only made the forecasts less accurate. Now, despite the limited role of the automated statistical baseline forecasts, managers referred to the forecast that they'd manipulated, the manipulated baseline forecasts, as the system forecasts. Now, carrying out the judgmental interventions involved a considerable amount of management effort and time. As I've mentioned, 17 review meetings took place each month. This could only be justified economically if the managers found that all their efforts were leading to improved accuracy. And as we've seen, many of the interventions, particularly the positive ones, did not. The company forecasters instead relied on their beliefs that all their interventions were valuable, without seeking any evidence that this was the case. So how can we explain this? Let's take the perspective of an individual forecaster. Occasionally, during the times they were forecasting, there were special events like sales promotions, for example. The statistical forecasts were unaware of this, and hence they had large errors. But these occasional large errors tended to contaminate the forecaster's view of the accuracy of the method in what we might call normal periods. A generally accurate method was regarded as not being accurate simply because of the occasional errors which occurred in special periods. Secondly, the managers tended to see the demand series as a set of explainable outcomes. Each movement in the graph could be explained. This was exacerbated by hindsight bias when they looked back at past demand. long-term systematic patterns, represented by the statistical forecast, we might call these the base rates, tended to be discounted because people thought that the movements around those base patterns were explainable and hence predictable. The forecasters also tended to focus on recent observations, and they attempted to get the software to find as close a fit as possible to recent observations, as you can see in the graph on the right. So there was definitely a recency bias, discounting what the history was telling them. Thirdly, it was known that the long-term product life cycle for the products was non-linear, and the managers therefore believed that the linear extrapolations embodied in the software were inadequate. But actually, for the short-term forecasts, they were reliable. Fourthly, the system did not explain its forecasts, but people had access to their own rationale, of course. So the software forecasts were from a black box. The judgmental forecasts had a clear rationale to those making them, so they tended to go with the judgmental forecast. Let's try and explain the system used now from a wider organizational perspective. After all, the forecasters didn't operate in isolation. Well, the main players were the middle managers, accountants, senior managers, and also the software vendor. All these people had particular interests. Let's take the software vendor to start with. Well, the software vendor would want to maximize sales, and they could do this by advertising the accuracy of their statistical methods, while also allowing facilities for judgmental interventions and saying how easily these interventions could be made. They would also want to maximize profit on the sale, and they could do this by selling a standard program rather than a customized package. Standardization, of course, means that all the local customization is done through judgmental intervention, but this was in the interests of the software vendor. And the software vendor would want to ensure continued use. So errors from judgmental interventions can't be blamed on the software. They could always say, well, you weren't really using the algorithm that we provided you with. What about the middle managers? Well, they wanted to be seen to be using an advanced software system, but they also wanted to retain control of the forecasts, so they required facilities for intervention. They wanted to produce baseline forecasts that looked credible to their colleagues at review meetings. And that requires a facility for easily manipulating the trend to get those baseline forecasts. Middle managers would also want to demonstrate their marketing expertise at review meetings. Again, this requires facilities for intervention. They wanted to believe that judgmental interventions invariably added value to justify the time of those meetings and the time spent adjusting the baseline forecasts. So they avoided error calculations and forecast monitoring. And of course, everybody wanted to stay with the current system because they didn't want the disruption of having to learn and implement a new system. What about the senior managers? Well, they wanted to be seen as providing their staff with advanced forecasting software, but at the same time, they wanted to keep those software purchase costs low. Again, they preferred a standard system. They wanted to encourage participation of middle managers in the forecasting process. This required facilities for intervention and graphs and tabular displays for review meetings, which the software provided. And they wanted to avoid disruption caused by implementing a new system. So all the actors, all the players, had an aligned interest in the existing forecasting process, despite its flaws. There were no forces within the network of players that would stimulate change. Not surprisingly, this forecasting process persisted for many years. In the end, it took outside intervention by managers, who were external to the UK subsidiary, to bring about a new centralised system. But there's scant evidence that even this system is an improvement, and there's still heavy use of judgmental interventions in the UK subsidiary. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul, for your presentation. We have actually a minute for one question, maybe, if we have any.
I've got a comment as a worker on this, if I may. I think if you look at the IJF or the contributions to this conference, it's all about, except of course the judgmental sessions, it's all about models, new models. We never know how these models are used, do we? And as this case study, which is, as far as we know, Paul, wasn't it the only case study? It's not the only organizational research, but it is the only detailed case study that explains how these interventions, to a certain extent anyway, are used and why, in a sense, they're supported by the company. I mean, there are other reasons as well concerned, as we've shown, true of this particular company. There is value added, at least with that negative intervention. So it's not a wholly negative view. But so the importance of the work is really to highlight the interactions in an organizational setting.
Yes, thank you very much, Robert, for your comment. And our next presenter is Fotis Petropoulos from University of Bath. Fotis, go ahead.
Maybe that's better. Right. My name is Fotis Petropoulos. I am from the University of Bath, and I'm going to present you National Technical University of Athens. And this work is on judgmental selection of the parameters for simple forecasting models. And essentially, I will continue what Anna was discussing earlier on the uses of judgment in different stages of the forecasting process. And I will kind of agree with Robert that if you see around the conference, it is all about big data, machine learning, new models, new statistical models. But I would still argue that judgment has still an important role to play in decision making. And this is evident from the many interesting talks in the judgmental forecasting sessions, but also the many very special issues and special sections the last 2-3 years on behavioral operations and behavioral operational research in general. So in my view, we should see judgment as complementing automated algorithms in practical settings, not necessarily have judgment only to produce forecasts, but taking insights from judgment, innovative insights, and essentially revise our algorithmic approaches through these insights. And traditionally, if we see like 25-30 years ago, judgment was used predominantly on producing forecasts directly, so purely judgmental forecasts. And the last 20 years or so have seen a lot of research around judgmental revisions or judgmental interventions or judgmental adjustments of statistical forecasts to include special cases or even for political reasons in some cases. And the last few years, we have also seen some research on judgmental model selection, on how judgment can be used to select models instead of, let's say, information criteria or other automatic approaches. So today we're going to see how judgment can be used to select parameters for forecasting models and how this compares against automatic parameter selection. And despite that, we have a plethora of good algorithms to select and estimate optimal values for the parameters of our forecasting models. Still, it is the case that modern forecasting software always allows users to manipulate the optimal selected values and adjust these model parameters values. And what we ask here is, should this be the case? Should the system allow this kind of interventions on the automatically selected model parameters. And to answer this question from an empirical point of view, here we focus on a simple forecasting method on the simple exponential smoothing, and in particular on one of the parameters of simple exponential smoothing, which is the alpha smoothing parameter. So we have two research questions here. The first research question is how humans perform compared to algorithms in selecting parameters for simple forecasting models, and in particular for SES, and also what influences humans in this judgmental selection, if there are any aspects in the design of support systems or in the information provided that influences them in this selection. So we approach this from a behavioral experiment point of view. We have designed a dedicated system, and we have invited participants with technical expertise to take part in this. And we have also applied a randomized controlled trial to see what exactly influences these judgmental selections. And as I said, we focus on participants with technical expertise, and this suggests essentially that they know how SES works, how simple exponential smoothing works, and they know also how automatic parameter selection for simple exponential smoothing works with minimization of MSE, etc., etc. And we don't really do anything about the domain expertise. In essence, the data that we provide to the participants here are anonymized, so domain expertise, we consider this as non-relevant for this particular study. We have 6 hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that humans are better in choosing the alpha smoothing parameter when they are provided with the in-sample fitted values of the model. And this essentially derives from the technical expertise, because they know that the software would select the best parameter based on the minimization of these residuals. So assume that if they are given the in-sample fit of the model, then they will select the parameters better. Also, we believe that they will be better in selecting the smoothing parameter if we initially provide them with the optimal value rather than a random value, and this is essentially our second hypothesis. Our third and fourth hypotheses are based on a widely known cognitive bias, which is called anchoring, and this essentially refers to humans' inability to depart from an initial value. And here we investigate 2 cases of anchoring. The first case is departing from the initially provided smoothing parameter, but also we say that they might act rational in the sense that they will be anchored more in the initial smoothing parameter if we tell them that this is optimal compared to if we tell them that this is random. And the fourth hypothesis is that humans will select generally a higher smoothing parameter compared to the optimal selection, compared to the statistical selection. In essence, what we say here is that humans will be anchored more on the last available observation, because by increasing the alpha smoothing parameter, essentially they are increasing the weight for the last available observation. Hypotheses 5 and 6 refer to combination and aggregation. 5, essentially we say that a combination of the forecast that is derived from the statistically selected parameter and the forecast that is derived from the simple parameter, if we take the 2 and combine them, then we will improve the forecast overall. And hypothesis 6, we essentially hypothesize that if we aggregate the forecasts from multiple judgmental parameter selections, we will have a better forecast compared to individual judgmental parameter selection. Right, as I said, we approach this study through a behavioral experiment. So we have a 2x2 factorial design here. One factor is with regards to the provision of the in-sample fitted values or not, and the other factor is with regards to the alpha smoothing parameter that is provided initially to the users being random or statistically optimal based on the in-sample MSE optimization. So the participants were given 30 time series. I will discuss about time series in a bit, and they asked to select the best optimal value for alpha based on their judgment. Given a slider, the slider allowed them for essentially 101 options from 0 to 1 with step 0.001, and exactly the same process was used for selecting the optimal value for alpha. There was also an end of experiment questionnaire where we asked some particular details about the experience of the experiment, and also what they believe that influenced their selections, and I will be touching on that as well. And we managed to get 131 participants. These are students, masters and undergraduate students in the National Technical University of Athens, but all of them have been taught how exponential smoothing works before the experiment. So we consider these students to have the technical expertise when it comes to simple exponential smoothing. And they will also randomly allocate it to a condition. Now, this is a screenshot of the experiment in the condition that the fitted values were given to the participants. And you can see here that we provide the 3 steps ahead point forecast with the 95% prediction intervals. And on the right-hand side, you can see the slider through which they can select the smoothing parameter, and then they can submit to go to the next series. With regards to the selection of the data, these are real data, and they come from the Philip Hans Francis and Legger's pharmaceutical dataset, which consists of 1,000 real-time series. All time series are of 25 months long, and we kept 22 for fitting and 3 for auto-sample evaluation. And how we selected the third time series out of the 1,000 time series is that we essentially try to identify a representative sample of third time series so that the differences between the optimal in sample and the best out sample alpha value is the same as with the whole sample. And this is provided from the histograms on the top of the screen. We measured performance using 2 KPIs. The first one is score, which is the average rank of the selections. As I said, the options for alpha there were 101 options, so the worst option is given a score of 0, the best option is given a score of 100, average across 30 series, and higher values here are better. The second KPI is the average relative mean absolute error introduced by Davydenko and Robert here. And this is essentially the accuracy relatively to the statistical benchmark, and the benchmark in this case is the statistical forecast with the in-sample MSE-based optimization for alpha. And we apply geometric mean across series, and lower values are better, and values lower than unity imply improvement over the statistical benchmark. So let's go now to our results. In this slide, we can see box plots, and for each box plot, for each color, we have a different condition. The red color here is no fitted values, random initial, and so on and so forth, as you can see on the bottom. On the left-hand side, we have the score, and on the right, we have the average relative mean absolute error. Now, the hypothesis 1 referred to that if we provide the initial, the in-sample fitted values, then the performance of the humans will be better, which is rejected. As you can see, if we provide the fitted values, actually, in every case, the performance is worse, significantly worse, or statistically indifferent. So the provision of each sample does not improve the performance of selection, and this is essentially indication of non-rational behavior, and I will be discussing about this in a second. The second hypothesis was with regards to the better performance if an optimal initial parameter is provided, and this hypothesis is accepted. In fact, the score is significantly better when an optimal value initial is provided, and the improvements in average relative mean absolute error are there, but they are not significant. With regards to anchoring, the hypothesis 3 was with regards to that the humans will be more heavily anchored on the optimal initial value rather than the random initial value, and this hypothesis is accepted, and it is also in line with regards to how the participants perceived that they were anchored on the initial value. With regards to hypothesis 4, which essentially refers to anchoring to the last available observation, in other words, selecting a higher alpha smoothing parameter compared to the statistical selection, is also accepted. And this is in contrast to what participants believe they did. And they actually believe that they didn't focus on the very few last observations, but they focused on the whole time series, which is not actually what they did. The last two hypotheses, again, are around combination and aggregation. Hypothesis 5, we explore the performance where the statistical forecast and the judgmental parameter forecast were combined with equal weights, 50-50. And in this case, we can see that each treatment, each condition is improved compared to simply judgmental selection. And also now we have performances, average relative mean absolute errors, that are lower than 1, which are better than the MSC statistical benchmark. And these differences are also significant here. In hypothesis 6, where we aggregated together small groups of people, small crowds, here we aggregated every 5 people, if I'm not mistaken, we do have, again, improvements compared to individual parameter selection. And in this case, the condition with no fitted values and optimal initial is significantly better and outperforms the statistical benchmark. So a couple of slides for discussion here. First of all, it is quite surprising that the provision of the in-sample fitted values did not offer improvements in terms of accuracy. And as I said earlier, this violates a hyper-rational behavior from the participants' point of view in 2 ways. The first way is that given the technical expertise of the participants, they should know that they should aim for alpha smoothing parameters that minimize the differences between the actuals and the fitted values, which is not what they did. And also, it's contrast with the statement that pay attention to the whole series as opposed to the very last few observations. Some concluding remarks here. First of all, does it worth the cost, judgmental parameter selection? It is a quite costly process. On average, our participants took about 30-35 seconds to process each time series, and we're asking if this additional computational cost worth the effort. Of course, a way to deal with that is to limit the number of options available to the participants, to the managers, not have 101 options, but maybe 11 options. And in another study have done essentially suboptimally selecting the smoothing parameters may not necessarily affect the out-of-sample accuracy. Another way to deal with that would be to measure the forecast value added and also trade off with the additional resources that they are needed to complete the process. And of course, we open a discussion about how we should go with the design of support systems, should allow or should not allow judgmental manipulation of the parameter selection. And if we do allow it, if the resources also justify it, then maybe combination or aggregation are the ways forward. And of course, I think as a path for future research, I think we should also start exploring more widely, not just the parameter space, but also the hyperparameter space when it comes, for example, to how many data we fit the model with, or for example, to how to deal with pre-processing the data, or even how do we deal with selecting the pools, then the methods that go into our pool, in our selection pool for model selection, etc., etc. And that was me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fotis. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Are there any questions?
I have a question, Nikos here. I think it relates very well to what Paul and Robert mentioned as well. So Paul and Robert say that maybe people give too much, and researchers potentially give too much attention to models, potentially companies buying software give too much attention to the repertoire of models. But I would argue it's a general lack of interest in getting any decent forecasting. So Fotis, you presented now in some sense how we can put a bit of judgment in the models. How do you see that as a process in practice?
As a process in practice, I have to be honest with you, I haven't really thought about it, but I think, well, if it comes to just putting one person selected parameters, I think we shouldn't really allow that. This is what the results here say. And unless we go to combination aggregation, which of course requires redesigning the support systems, I think the best way to do at the moment is not to allow participants to do parameter selection, just method parameter selection as it comes. Now, we want to expand the study to at least one more method, simply moving averages, and potentially also to hold, which will have two parameters, alpha and beta, because we'd like to expand our understanding of exactly how this works and maybe understand what we can get out of this and potentially how we can improve the automatic selection of judgmental parameters by having these insights from the judgmental area. In the sense, Nikos, this goes back also to our work on model selection, where for me, the most exciting finding was that humans may not be able necessarily to outperform statistical selection, but they are surely better in avoiding the worst models. So this is another way to go. So how humans essentially utilize the out-of-sample forecasts and how we can somehow program it back into the optimization process, potentially to further improve this. That would be my goal. But right now, how we deal with that, I think that the results suggest that we shouldn't allow them to do any interventions.
Okay, thank you very much. I will stop you here. We have the last presentation, and actually it's a PhD student's presentation, right, Rebecca? You still?
Yes,
so please rate the presentation on Wova at the end of this presentation. So yeah, Shari, can you turn it?
My name is Rebecca Brow, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Arkansas. Today, I will be presenting my research when managers meet models, integrating human judgment and analytics. And my co-authors on this research are Dr. John Aloysius from the University of Arkansas and Dr. Enno Ziemsen from the University of Wisconsin. Now, I thought it would be useful to start out my presentation with a quote from a senior vice president of a retailer. I was interviewing him about forecasting practice, and we got onto this interesting conversation topic of touchability versus accountability in forecasting. Now, he says, if my role is defined as a forecast analyst, my accountability is forecast accuracy. If I'm heavily leveraging AI and machine learning to forecast without my input, but the outcome is bad, I'm still accountable. What does accountability without touchability create? Frustration. I would like you to keep in mind this thought of whether or not we should have forecasting without input of the human as we move throughout this. Now, for this research, it is important to understand what is currently happening within practice in regards to forecasting. In a survey of over 240 firms, 13.4% of respondents indicated that their forecasting practice relied solely on human judgment. So this means there was no use of statistical models. On the other hand, we see that 3% of respondents relied solely on statistical models. However, we can see that 83.6% of firms are not in either one of the extremes. They're using human judgment and statistical models together. in some kind of way. And so today we're going to be talking about the way that judgment and models are brought together. First of all, I'd like to give a little background as to why integrated forecasts are desirable. So when we think about the strengths of humans and the strengths of models, first of all, humans are able to diagnose special events. Humans use contextual information, which can be information that is either hard information, such as the weather of a heat wave that is happening that was not predicted, or it could be a surprise promotion from a competitor, or it could be soft information, such as knowledge of a political climate, or, for example, the pandemic as it began in the early stages. So with contextual information in this research, we're looking at things that the model does not have access to. So these are special events that really only a human would be able to diagnose and identify. And it is during these times of special events that humans are able to predict non-systematic variability, which is useful really during those special events. On the other hand, when we think about the strengths of models, models are able to predict systematic variability. So what we can see is the strengths of humans and models are complementary. And it's best to bring them together because in the words of Blattberg and Hawk, when models are weak, humans are strong and vice versa. So it is important to have these integrated forecasts. We still need human judgment for these special events. But then the question becomes, how best should we integrate human judgment and model-based forecasts? And that is the research question that I will be addressing today. So to give a little bit of background, I know that all of you are familiar with these methods of forecasting, but I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page as to the terms that I was using in this presentation. So first of all, we have the judgment forecast on one hand, which is a human alone with no model or a system to assist them. And on the other side of the extreme, we have the model forecast. This is where there is no touch from a human forecaster. It is purely an automated forecast. Let's talk about the various methods of integration. And first we have judgmental adjustment. Judgmental adjustment is where a model creates the forecast and then a human receives the output and is able to adjust based on any contextual information they may have. Judgmental adjustment is the most common form of integrated forecasting. Second method of integration, which is established in practice and literature, is quantitative correction. Quantitative correction relies on the human to provide a judgment forecast, which is monitored by a model. And the model identifies any systematic bias that may be present in the judgment forecast and corrects for that bias. The third method of integration is a combined forecast. And what we mean by this is the judgment forecast is computed independently from the model forecast. However, the two are then brought together through an average. And in our research, we use an equal weighted average according to Blattberg and Hawk. Input to model is the last method of integration in current literature. And input to model allows for the human to input their judgment either through variable selection, model specification, or parameter estimation. Next, I am going to introduce two methods of integration that use machine learning. These methods of integration use supervised machine learning, meaning that the human is able to label the data set that is then used for training. In interactive machine learning, the human estimates the quantified change to demand, and that is then used as a piece of data to train the model. Now, human-guided machine learning takes this a step further and removes the need for the human to estimate the change to demand. And human-guided machine learning simply asks the human to indicate to the model whether it is a period of special events or not. And the model is then able to look at past instances of the same indicated special event and quantify the change to demand. In order to compare all of these methods of integration to answer that question of which is the best, we used a 2x8 experiment. And what we did was we had 2 treatments for each method of forecasting. And the first, the participants received contextual information about a special event that would be occurring and that it would change demand. In the no contextual information treatments, the individuals still saw that there were changes to demand. However, they did not receive any contextual information about this. And because I do not have much time, I will not be going into detail about this experiment. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, or we can go into a breakout room following this presentation. So I would like to discuss 3 main findings that we have from this experiment. And the first is looking at humans' use of contextual information. So if you look at this graph below, what you can see is 3 bars. The one on the furthest left is regarding the judgment forecast with no contextual information. The middle bar is the judgment forecast with contextual information. And the furthest right is the model forecast, so there is no contextual information. The y-axis here is the mean absolute error. So what we can see is when comparing the judgment forecast with no contextual information to the judgment forecast with contextual information, there is a 28% reduction in error. And when we compare the judgment forecast with contextual information to the model forecast, there is a 10% reduction in error. So humans' use of contextual information is important, and it should remain part of the forecasting process. So going back to the senior vice president's comment about whether human input is still needed, we find that human input is indeed still needed during times of special event. Next, we see that models better identify systematic variability than humans. So looking at these 2 graphs below, on the left-hand side, we have the judgment forecast over time, and the y-axis again is mean absolute error. And so we can see that as time goes on, from period 3 to 9, there's no indication of learning. The human is not able to identify the systematic variability at this time. Now, on the right-hand side with the model forecast, we can see that there is evidence of learning. As time goes on, the model is able to identify the systematic variability and the error reduces. Now, finding 3 is really what this research is about. So we compared the methods of integration, the 4 established methods of integration, along with our 2 new methods of integration using machine learning. And we compared these to each other as well as to the model forecast. And what this graph shows is the comparison using a Kruskal-Wallis test, the comparison of the 4 methods of integration that are established. Those are the bars in blue compared to the model forecast, and we don't see much of a difference. However, when we compare the 2 methods of integration with machine learning, interactive machine learning and human-guided machine learning, there is indeed a reduction in error. So these 2 methods are able to use the strengths of humans and models together to reduce the error overall. But this is where it gets really interesting. We also ran a simulation to see if the participants were able to identify the special events when they were occurring and otherwise did not interfere with the model. what happened, and what we can see is there was a 72% reduction in error. So what this suggests is these machine learning methods of integration have great potential to increase accuracy. However, we need to help the humans to understand what their role is and what their strengths are, how they contribute to the forecast. And that will be able to really help get the strengths of humans and models together. So in conclusion, we see that even in an analytics-centered world, that contextual information is important and we cannot have it without humans. So we need to make sure that they are included in the forecasting process as we advance forward. Additionally, we found that the most accurate methods of forecasting use machine learning to unite the strengths of human judgment and models. And so this is interactive machine learning and human-guided machine learning. We are actually testing these two, interactive machine learning and human-guided machine learning, in a field experiment right now with a firm to see how these translate into practice and how they really can help. The last thing from the looking at the comparison of the optimal human-guided machine learning and interactive machine learning compared to how it was used, we can see that the forecasting process needs to have a well-designed and executed process in order to really take advantage of the strengths of humans and models. So thank you for your time. I'd like to open it up for questions. And additionally, if you'd like to email me, my email is included on the slide. Thanks.
Excellent. Rebecca is here, right? Yeah. Cool. We have around 5 minutes for questions. So any comments, any questions here would be welcome. Or I can even start. I'm actually curious why combined forecast didn't perform well. Did you investigate this?
I did. So actually what I was showing is during the times of the special events. So when there was a shock to demand. So it was during those times that the model just did absolutely horribly. And we also know that humans aren't that great when they're on their own with just the judgmental forecast. And so I think that it was because it was during those times of special events that we see that combined did as poorly as it did.
Interesting.
Hi, Rebecca. Robert Fart here. What was your simulation model of the data?
So it was actually really simple. It's just a multivariate regression, and I just used Python to loop through all of the periods.
And what were the sort of special events? What were the yeah, I think you said there were special events, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. So the probability distribution was with a mean of 41. And there was just a standard deviation of, I believe it was 7. So really it was all from the same probability distribution that these shocks to demand were chosen. And then there was no context given as to what these special events were. There was simply a probability distribution.
So where is the machine learning getting its value from?
It's from the multivariate regression.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so Paul Gurin here, Rebecca. How did you, I noticed that the quantitative correction, the sort of de-biasing of the judgmental forecast, I think actually did worse on your bar chart. How did you do the correction? Did you simply find the mean bias and subtract it, or did you use something like tiles correction?
It was just the simple mean and then corrected.
Yes.
And we are actually planning to, moving forward, use tiles correction.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, then I will thank everyone for presentations, for great presentations, and being with us here. And actually, let me remind again that we have 2 students here. So if you could please rate their presentations in Wova app, that would be great. And thank you very much again for joining us. It was really interesting. I think we all actually presented on the same more or less topic. So it's a great combination of presentations in the end. Okay, if you have any questions or if you have any comments, you can find every presenter here on Wova, of course, and please send emails or chat there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, thanks, Anna. Thanks all.
Thank you, Shari, for organizing this as well, actually.
Thank you very much for the session, guys.
Yeah, you as well, Anna. Always happy to organize something together. See you,
great.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for a fantastic session. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.